Welcome to Veggie 360, where you're going to learn how to grow great tasting veggies year-round in small spaces. How would you like to learn how to grow and harvest more veggies in the space that you have available? Well, we're going to talk about that today. There's a variety of things that you can do in your garden to actually increase yield or harvest. We'll talk about some of those methods today, and we'll take a short tour of the garden so that you can see how we use those methods in our garden. Before we do, though, I'd like to give you more of a bird's eye view of the garden to kind of understand the layout. We have a series of raised beds that are built on the back side of the house and against a retaining wall. We fenced it in to keep the wildlife out. In our area, we've got herds of deer that come through on a regular basis. We've got groundhogs, bunnies. Got tired of feeding the wildlife, so we fenced it in. One of the principles that I'm going to be talking about is the use of vertical space. As you see from this bird's eye view, we have a planter box on top of the deer fence. We've planted strawberries in there, so we really increase the plantable space in the garden. Now let's talk specifically about what these methods are that you can use for increasing yield. Well, the first one is using raised beds. Conventional gardening, you look at the back of the seed packet, it says plant in rows 1 to 2 feet apart. With raised beds, you don't have rows. Using raised beds, you're really maximizing the number of plants per square foot. You get more bang for the real estate using raised beds. You also need to capitalize on the sun exposure. For healthy plants, you need 6 to 8 hours of sunlight per day. Now, some plants can get by on less. For instance, your leafy greens. They need a minimum of 4 hours a day. Root vegetables need a minimum of 6. Now, your fruiting vegetables like the tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, eggplant, they really benefit from 8 hours or more. So you'll need to keep that in mind when picking your garden site. You also need to consider time of day. The heat of the sun and the amount of exposure. Some plants are more tolerant than others. Peppers, for instance, they can scorch. The actual peppers can get scorched in the hot sun, particularly when the temperatures are elevated in the summer. Another method you can use is grow up, not out. As I mentioned earlier, the planter box on top of the deer fence. Use that vertical space to your advantage. It's there. You can use a fence, put up a trellis, a cattle panel arch. But you need to watch the orientation because you don't want this vertical space or trellis to shade out the vegetables that are growing next to it. You can also use intensive or high density plant spacing. In our garden, we use square foot gardening method for determining the plant spacing. You can go to squarefootgardening.org and pull up a series of charts that give you the number of plants per square foot. And that's based on the size of the plants. It's a very simple method and very effective. You can also check with your local county extension agent or your master gardener in your area. You can also plant flowers. Not only do they add beauty, but they also attract the beneficial insects, the pollinators. They also eat the bad bugs, the bad insects. Some flowers will actually repel the bad insects, so plant more flowers in your garden. You can also harvest often and at the right degree of ripeness. If you let the fruiting vegetables stay on the plant too long, then it's going to signal the plant that it's done and it will stop producing. This does not apply to the leafy greens. You can harvest those at any stage. Baby greens are wonderful, but for your tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, eggplant, don't let them stay on the plant too long. You also need to have a garden plan. It's more than just a summer garden. You can actually plant in the spring, summer, and fall. By mapping out what you're going to plant when, you can actually use your space smarter. You can use succession planting, pulling out the lettuce and planting green beans when the lettuce has spent, pulling out the spinach and replacing with tomatoes. Have a plan in place for succession gardening. You can take that up to the next level by using interplanting. And what this is putting the replacement plants right in the same space as the one that's waning, so that when that waning plant is finally spent, cut it down or remove it, and the replacement plants are growing full. They've gotten a good head start. So you're really maximizing the use of your garden then. You also need to practice crop rotation. Diseases can build up in the soil and can affect your plants, decreasing the harvest. We'll get into that more on another video. Also, optimum soil health, we'll also get into that in another video, but my point here is healthy soil gives you healthy plants, more yield. So let's take that tour.
Nana.
As you come into the garden, you can see how we're using vertical space and intensive spacing to grow 10 tomato plants on this cattle panel arch. It's very efficient use of the space in this garden. We also have 2 tomato plants that we have staked up on rebar posts growing on the back side of the house, also using the vertical space. Now this part of the garden doesn't get as much sunlight because we've got a screened-in porch partially blocking the morning sun, giving it a dappled sun in the morning. And then in the late afternoon, the shrub and retaining wall blocks the sun on this part. Now it does create a nice microclimate, allowing us to grow the cool weather crops further on into the season because it doesn't get as hot. We do get enough sun on this side though for the tomatoes. These tomatoes are growing on the north side of the trellis. It's just not as lush. Now the okra was a great learning opportunity for us this year. Burgundy okra gets extremely tall. It is shading the plants that are growing in the bed next to it. The tomatoes have escaped the shade because they're so tall, and look how lush they are. But the basil, the green beans, and the peppers, they're really having to stretch to find some sun, and yield has been lower. Next year, we're going to pinch the growing tips on the okra to keep them short and encourage the side branching, and find a different spot to plant them next year. We have our second cattle panel trellis. This one's oriented north-south with pole beans growing on this side and cucumbers on the other side. The cucumbers are at the end of the season. They're looking a little spent right now. But the plants on the other side are still doing great. Even though they get a little bit of shade in the morning from the trellis, they get plenty of sun in the afternoon. Now on the other side of the cattle panel trellis, we have tomatoes and peppers that are growing up the deer fence. They're tied up to the fence, so we're using vertical space and high intensity spacing with 1 tomato plant per square foot. Same thing for peppers. We have blueberries, 3 blueberry bushes growing on the other side. That's creating more shade this year. They've really grown. We also trellis the zucchini. You can see it growing up the fence. We're also using the deer fence to trellis a variety of cucumbers, bitter melon, cantaloupe, a host of vining crops. At the base of the vining crops, we have green beans, peppers, and a variety of flowers, as well as some herbs. Now we have a wide variety of flowers to bring in the pollinators. In particular, we have Belinda's Dream Shrub Rose to add beauty to the garden. That's planted in honor of my dad. We also have some determinate tomato plants that are growing in cages. Now they're at the end of the growing season, and we've had some diseased leaves that we've had to remove from the base of the plants. We're also using some succession planting to start in the fall crops early.
feeding the soil each time we plant something new. We add about an inch of compost into the bed whenever we plant something in. So right now we have started planting the fall crops: broccoli, collard greens, kale, spinach, a bunch of leafy greens. Well, I hope you have enjoyed the tour and have enjoyed seeing how we're using the different methods in this garden to help us increase yield.
So if you learned something today, please hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos. Thank you.